Welcome to tonight's policy pitch on regulating the peer-to-peer economy. It's so great to see a big crowd here. My name is Jim Minifie. I run the Productivity Growth Program at the Grattan Institute, and I'd like to extend thanks to the State Library of Victoria, our partners and hosts. We're really delighted to be partnering with you in hosting this policy pitch series of events. I'm also really thrilled to have three speakers who, between them, cover some fascinating aspects of the peer-to-peer economy. Let me quickly introduce them, and I'll tell you a little bit about the model for this evening. Each of the three will speak for about 10 minutes, then we'll open up to discussion. First on my left is David Plouffe. Now, David, it's terrific to have you here. We understand that you've just flown in from elsewhere in the Asia Pacific. David joined Uber as the Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategy in September 2014. And David, you've got a very interesting background in running Obama's first winning 2008 campaign. And I'm sure there are many stories about that experience as well, although they're not the prime focus for this evening. So thank you so much for joining us. And next to David's left is Matt Barry. Now, Matt runs Freelancer. Freelancer is a firm which links together people who've got specialised skills and their potential hirers across a whole diverse range of fields. Matt has been Entrepreneur of the Year in 2011 for BRW, and again has got a wealth of experience in the startup space. So Matt, terrific to have you here. And then finally on Matt's left, Stephen King, Professor of Economics at Monash University and one of Australia's foremost competition policy experts. So I think between the three of you, I look forward to a engaged discussion on the peer-to-peer economy, what the opportunity is, why it's so disruptive, what policymakers need to consider in getting the most out of this innovative field for ordinary Australians. So thanks for joining, and if you're comfortable kicking off, David, you've got 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be with all of you. I thought I'd start off by asking, how many of you, show of hand, have used Uber or a service like it? Okay, good amount. I'll do a little less remedial then. But I thought I'd just start out for those of you who haven't used it or aren't familiar with it. So Uber, it actually started out, actually the idea was born in Paris by our two co-founders, but the service started in San Francisco. And it certainly wasn't meant to be a big idea. It was just an idea for it to make sure a group of friends could push a button and get a ride, because they were frustrated by the transportation service at the moment in Paris and in San Francisco. So the way Uber works is you download an app, Android or iPhone, and you press a button. And here in Melbourne, it's less than 3 minutes. In most cities, it's 2, 3, 4 minutes. Driver comes, you've already preloaded your credit card, so there's no cash payment. You put in a destination and tell the driver where you're going, and they take you there. And so it's basically, I think why it took off is it's consistent with how people are living the rest of their lives. You know, they're banking that way, they're doing research that way, they're staying in touch that way, they're, that's how they keep up with the world. A lot of work is done now on smartphones. I mean, here in Australia, it's the second, I think, highest smartphone penetration in the world, a place that invented Wi-Fi, so there's so much early adoption of innovation here in Australia, so we think it's a particularly great market for Uber. But it was just consistent with how people live their lives. And so what you're seeing, we're now in 283 cities around the world, in over 50 countries. Australia is one of our largest markets internationally and really growing. And it just started out as an idea of convenience, basically. And I think what's happened is you see uptake around the world where, here in the state of Victoria, we've already have over 2,500 drivers. And the new government that just came into power, I think they had a pledge of 10,000 drivers. And we think we're going to contribute a lot of that number, because we have every week in Australia more than 100 drivers who apply to be on the Uber platform. And first of all, the drivers, to fill you in a little bit on them, it's a little bit different than traditional transportation. Some have obviously been professional drivers. We have plenty actually who've come over who might have driven for taxi. Some still drive for taxi full time and drive a few hours on Uber. But it's also a lot of people who may be students, They may be retirees. It may be a stay-at-home parent. It may be someone who's caring for an elder parent. And it gives them complete control in a way that's very unique in our economy, meaning, so it's usually a car they own. Cars are only utilized 4% of the time, by the way, so it's an underutilized asset. They decide when they're going to drive, how long they're going to drive, if they're going to drive. They press a button, they go on the platform. They may drive for a few hours, they may drive for an hour. They may say, today my goal is to make $50, and they make it in an hour and a half, and they turn it off. So it's complete control. And so it is probably the most flexible way out there to either make a full income, and our drivers bring home a lot of money comparatively, but also to supplement income. And so I think what you're starting to see around the world is, in the beginning, it wasn't too long ago that Uber was this strange idea. It still may be to some people. Now you've had over 25 cities around the world actually pass forward-looking regulations to take into account ride-sharing. Well, obviously we have competitors, but that would allow Uber and our competitors to, and what's great about it is it enshrines in law things like background check regimes, other safety regimes, inspections, insurance. And so it lifts up the whole industry in many places. And I think the reason you've seen, large cities in the US, Calcutta in India, we're obviously in discussions here in Victoria, in other places in the region, and we think we're going to have a lot more municipalities move forward in countries in the coming months and years, is because they're seeing the effect. First of all, it was covered often in the media as, wow, this is sort of a choice between taxi drivers or taxi industry and Uber. And that's not what you're seeing. In market after market, it's really additive. And so it's an extra alternative for people. The taxi industry is still going to be very viable in cities, but it gives more opportunity to those taxi drivers. What we see, for instance, in San Francisco, people will be driving for a taxi company, they'll be driving for Uber, they may be driving for our competitor Lyft. It just gives them multiple opportunity to make the most money, whichever service is going to allow them to make the most living. But you also see the other benefits, which is reduction in drunk driving. Now, people don't have to make a plan, a designated driver. They just press a button, and they're not driving home drunk, which protects them and other people on the road. It's cutting down on distracted driving, which is something that's particularly a problem with younger people. You're seeing real public safety benefit, because every ride is GPS tracked. And so we're able to cooperate with law enforcement when there are incidents. We're starting to discuss with municipalities job training programs, because it's a really easy way for people. Here in Victoria, if we over-index in terms of where our drivers come from in places of high unemployment. So that's another place. We have a lot of people who this may be their second job, it may be their professional driver. We have a lot of people lose their job. But they have a car payment, they have a mortgage, and this allows them, after they've gone through a background check, to get on the road and make real money. So I think what you're starting to see around the world is elected officials and regulators are seeing, okay, this new service can complement the taxi service, public transportation, people obviously still driving themselves. We also think ultimately it's going to have a huge impact on congestion and emissions. We have a product we're really excited about. It's a carpooling product called Uber Pool, and it's now operating in San Francisco, Paris, and New York. And we hope to bring it to as many cities as we can. And what that means is, if you're going, let's say you were to go from here to the airport, let's say, or here across the city, you're basically able to go for half price of what an UberX ride would be. So if you're going in, let's say I see that exit sign back there. If I'm going to that exit sign, and one of you in the second row is going to the same direction, and you're within 2 minutes, so it can't take you out of your way, but you say, I'd like to Uber Pool if someone can match with me. You hop in that car, and you're basically going in the same destination. So it's much less expensive for you to take that ride. The driver makes a lot more money because they're always on a trip. A lot of professional drivers aren't driving 60 minutes out of 60 minutes. They're driving 10, 12 minutes. This keeps our drivers really, really busy. And that's really when you see the effect of taking cars off the road and reducing congestion. And basically every city in the world is dealing with an epidemic of congestion. And it's only going to get worse. Some people have described it by the middle of the next decade, the world's going to be facing a Carmageddon. So every municipality is thinking about, how can we get more cars off the road? And with Uber Pool, you begin to see that. In San Francisco, we're really starting to see a lot of people who might have taken traditional UberX, which is just somebody driving a Prius, or Uber Black, which is the more the luxury black car service. Now they're Uber pooling, because it's basically maybe takes them an extra minute or two, but they're able to save money. There's a good social dynamic, and a lot of people feel good about contributing to lower congestion. So we're really excited about that project in terms of our vision, and we think we're going to bring that to a lot of cities in the coming months and years. And then you really get the economic benefit of job creation and income generating opportunity, safety benefits, and you begin then to get real congestion benefits. So we're excited about the future, and obviously we want to work with governments in a cooperative way about a way forward. And I think that what that requires is most transportation regulations were written well before cell phone technologies, flat screen TVs, cable TV, smartphones. They didn't envision these types of technologies in service. And so what we've been able to do around the world is really have regulators and elected officials look for how can we refashion regulations in a way. And I think there's been a little bit of a misconception out there that Uber doesn't want to be regulated, and we do. I mean, we're in the room every day trying to help governments figure out how to move forward in a smart way with modern regulations that don't have a lot of barriers to entry so people can get on the road and start making money. That really does provide competition and choice. So consumers have choice. It's one more choice in terms of how they get around their city. But drivers then have choice. If you're a professional driver, now you have multiple potential platforms to choose from. So we think the benefit for cities is going to be profound in the long run. And so we're hopeful that most cities and most countries where that's appropriate, most states, find a way forward. So there's modern, forward-looking regulations. And we think there's a lot of benefit for city also in the spirit of data. We struck our first deal with data with the city of Boston in the United States, a city that has really modern, forward-looking ride-sharing regulations. And that is great information for a city about the trips that are happening in their city, when they're happening, congestion, traffic patterns. And that's going to enable cities to make really smart decisions, but also save a lot of money, because it's probably going to become the best picture they have about how people are moving around their cities in a way they've never had before. So we think ultimately this is a really good opportunity for cities. I'm motivated about it because one of the real challenges in my previous life was, how do you get enough income opportunities for the broadest segment of the population? And Uber and services like it really provide a great, either full-time, so people can earn a living wage and take care of their family, or to supplement that income to allow them to really provide for their family. So we think it's an exciting opportunity, and we think if you look here in Australia and in a lot of countries around the world, over the next 2 or 3 years, Uber and services like it are probably going to be responsible for a lot of the jobs and income producing opportunities. And we're excited for what that means for the environment, for the economy, for knowing and being smarter about city planning, but also in terms of what that means for cities. There's going to be a lot more people now coming into city core, because in a lot of places where you're not in an urban core, really the choice is, am I going to drive in or not? Now you have an opportunity where you press a button, within 2 minutes the ride's there, you go into the city, and whenever you're ready to come home after dinner or whatever, after the show, you're going to press a button and it's going to be reliable. And that's the other core principle of Uber. It's got to be affordable, it's got to be safe, but it also have to be reliable. And when you get wait times down to 2 or 3 minutes, then people know they can count on it to get to their job, to come home and relieve the babysitter, to go out and to dinner. They know they can count on it. There's not going to be any question of, is it going to be here in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or is it going to show up at all? It's going to be there. And they're able to rate their driver, and the driver's able to rate the passenger. So there's a great feedback mechanism of accountability. So anyway, we look forward to more questions, but I wanted to give a quick overview of Uber as we see it here in Australia. Thanks.
David, terrific. Thank you so much. Well, Matt, let's move on. You run a very different business in terms of its subject matter, but some of the underlying platform characteristics are the same. So tell us a bit about Freelancer.
Sure. Well, this is long. So what we do is we run the world's largest online freelancing and crowdsourcing marketplace. And it basically, in layman's terms, it's eBay for jobs. We connect up 14.4 million people all around the planet. Fundamentally, two types of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who are small businesses, and we help them turn that spark of an idea about building a business or creating a business or changing a business or building a new product or service with an online workforce to actually turn that dream into reality. And we take away the time, the cost, and the hassle of getting that done, right? Because there's people all around the world that can do the job for you any time of day. And we also empower entrepreneurs in the developing world, and these are people who are, as the internet's proliferating through the developing world, going online and raising their income levels by working in technical jobs that are otherwise, for the most part, unavailable to them in the location they're in. And so fundamentally, there's a number of really big global macro themes that I think maybe will resonate through tonight's talk. But the themes that we built Freelancer on are the fact that it's pretty hard to understand this, but there's 7.1 billion people on the planet. 4 billion people are not connected yet. Right, so most of the world's population, 60% of the world's population, have not joined the internet, but they're coming in at a dramatic pace. They're coming in at double-digit rates. Already, if you look at the top 10 US consumer internet websites globally, 81% of the traffic is non-US traffic. So it's coming from all around the world, not from the US. The internet started very much in the US, but now it's a lot more inclusive. Online education is proliferating all around the world. So if you have an internet connection, no matter where you live, if it's in the Philippines or Bangladesh or Vietnam, you can now go online and access a very low-cost, high-quality education. So you can self-train and self-tool yourself. And fundamentally, what we're doing is we're allowing people to come along and go online and basically increase the prosperity in their lives by working in jobs for anyone all around the world. We're an Australian company. We floated on the Australian Securities Exchange in November of 2013. We are very much like Uber in the fact we're an online marketplace, right? So where buyers and sellers come together and get things done. And I think fundamentally, just to kind of maybe explain a little bit for a minute or two about the sharing economy and what the sharing economy or the rental economy or the collaborative economy basically is that due to advances in the internet and in software and devices like mobile phones, it's allowed more efficient utilization of resources and even more importantly, more efficient marshalling of those resources, right? So, people have, I think Dave mentioned that people have, cars sitting around in their garage all day, used 4% of the time. Well, with Uber, you can get those cars out there and get them more efficient, and as a result, solve a lot of problems around, pollution, congestion, and so on. With Freelancer, there's people all around the world with all sorts of different skill sets, but they may be stuck in a certain location where there's no jobs available in that particular area. So let's say I want to be an expert in mobile phone app development for healthcare, right? And I'm somewhere in Bangladesh. There's probably no jobs for me, and if there are jobs, they're very, very low paying. But now I can go online. I can work for a global client base, and I can actually go find a job and work in that particular area. Or maybe I'm retired. Maybe I used to be an accountant, and I worked a full-time job. And now I live out the country somewhere. Now I can go online and I can work as an accountant, and maybe 1 day a week or 2 days a week, and so forth. Or maybe I'm young. I'm studying at school, and I have a few hours here or there, kind of to fill in time. Either maybe I'm starting a business on the side and have a bit of sort of passive cash flow coming in. I can do that very, very low cost now because we remove the time, the hassle, and the cost of going and starting your own business. Or maybe I can, if there's a skill set I want to work in, I can go work in that skill set. For people who want to change careers, maybe you're stuck in a job that you really hate, 9 to 5. You can't really make the big leap into a new career, instantly because you've got no experience. But maybe on the side, on the weekends, and maybe after hours, you can kind of play in a new area and learn a new skill set and kind of work online and kind of build it up and earn an income at the same time. So, we're doing a whole bunch of, I think, a lot of good around the world. In the Western world, primarily our users are employers. They're people who hire people to get things done. Typically, you're a small business owner. They're a cafe owner. They want to build a website. They're busy all day. They don't have a lot of money. They look around. They try and get a web designer to kind of help them, to design a website. Maybe it costs them $5,000 or $10,000. They can't really afford that, but maybe they could afford, $300 or $400. Right, so we really help them kind of go online and actually grow their business and compete in the modern world, which is hyper competitive and hyper connected, and really in the developing world, it's really helping people get work. And so, in terms of policy issues, kind of really affecting the space, there's obviously the internet's quite disruptive and new business models are disruptive, etc. And I think there, particularly in the sharing economy, there's a lot of regulation that exists that's kind of archaic and it's old and it's belonged to a time before the internet, a time before we had mobile phones, and before software came along and was in everyone's sort of hands. And I think that a lot of that regulation is just outdated. Now, of course, anytime the government a lot of the time the government comes in and kind of tries to set rules in certain industries and certain ways in which things need to be done, it can create discontinuities and kind of distortions in the market where, incumbents who are protected by that regulation, maybe can reap the benefit of that and windfall profits as a result. And then when something new comes along, kind of threatens that, there's obviously a lot of vested interests that kind of come out of the woodwork to kind of say, well, no, this is really bad for A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But at the end of the day, the sharing economy is all about better use of resources, better marshalling of those resources, and that leads to a whole bunch of really positive benefits for economies globally. Whether it's Uber, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's something like Freelancer, or any of the other many other models that have kind of come up. And the great thing about the world today with the internet is the rate of innovation is fantastic, and as a result of that, you can deliver products and services to market a lot quicker that are fantastic services. I mean, I used Uber for the first time a couple of years ago. Let me tell you, I was hooked. I mean, this is a service that is so much better than what's out there. It is just so much easier to get a car. You pull out a phone, you hit a button, and you can see the car arriving. It's quite simple in terms of concept, but the cars are great. They're modern. They're clean. You know exactly where the car is. No longer you're kind of waiting on the phone and kind of waiting for is the taxi going to turn up or is it not going to turn up or who knows, etc. And the quality of the drivers, I think, is in my experience, has been a lot better as well. They tend to know where they're going, and it's friendly. The cars are kind of modern, etc. A little funny story is I was one of the first guys to sign up for Uber for Business, and they said, well, come around and we'll kind of do a little thing. I said, could I actually sign up as an UberX driver? And that'd be kind of fun. And I actually filled in the application form and I was rejected. And I have a very nice new car, but the problem was when I was a student in 1991, I lost my license for 3 months for speeding, and as a result, a little bit over the limit, and as a result, I'm banned from being an Uber driver. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit frustrating.
Commercial boats for the service and for how great our background checks work. So. And we got that on film, I think.
Well, anyway, yeah, you can use that on the film.
Matt, but, can I ask whether you qualify on your own platform?
Yeah, well, my platform's a little bit different, and I have root access to my platform, but I don't pass a lot of the certification. We have a self-certifying system and a self-governance system on Freelancer. So the way it works is, luckily, we don't really experience a lot of regulation because most of our jobs are small jobs. They're cross-border, so someone overseas is doing a small job for you. It lasts maybe a few days or a few hours or a week or two. I mean, the main issues we have around regulation is getting payments to someone. So getting a payment to someone in Bangladesh or a payment to someone in India, and all around the world, you've got to deal with all these different countries and all the regulations that change every day on that respect. But the way that our marketplace works is the more jobs you do, the better the job you do, the more you get paid, and the better the feedback is from the users. You crowdsource the feedback. The higher you gain what we call reputation, and that reputation builds over time, and that determines how high you appear when you bid on a job in the organic listings or when you're in the directory, and we order you from the top to the bottom. The top guy has done the most jobs, been paid the most, got the best feedback. The guy at the bottom is unrated, basically. We don't know anything about that person. If you do something really bad, like something egregious, then it goes to a support team, and we'll look into potentially kick someone off the platform, as Uber does, and all the other online marketplaces do as well. But it's the whole thing about self-governance. It's self-regulating, and the great thing about the sharing economy is that it's really driven down the cost of actually finding resources, transacting with those resources, whether it's staffing or cars or houses or whatever it may be, and ultimately, I think it's better for everyone.
Well, that's the sell proposition, and I'm sure that we'll be able to take the devil's advocate questions further, but thank you, Matt. Now, Stephen, you're I hesitate to say a regulator at heart, but you've thought pretty hard about the right role for regulation. It'd be terrific to hear your thoughts about what role regulators might have in this brave new world.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I guess let me start by saying I think Uber, Freelancer, Airbnb, they are just great. They are transforming the economy. But my role here is to be the wet blanket. And so I'm going to, you've had the flames of passion that we've seen in the last few minutes. I'm going to turn them into a bit of smoke. Because there's at least 3 concerns that we need to deal with from a public policy and a regulatory perspective with the peer-to-peer economy, the sharing economy, these new services. And they are, how do they fit into our competition laws and regulations? how do they fit into our consumer laws and regulations, and how do they fit in with incumbents? So let me run through those three. Now, first off, let me start off on the competition side. The key thing to realise about the peer-to-peer economy, the sharing economy, is that we have seen lots of this before. So there are similar services that have been around that have raised the same sort of issues for a long time. Credit cards, for example, are a classic example of a platform that raises those issues, merchants on one side, consumers on the other, the banks and the systems in the middle. Shopping centres are another classic example of a platform. They bring together a range of retailers and they bring together the consumers. Amazon is just an online shopping centre. Advertising and the media, same sort of thing. So we know a lot about these. So we know a lot about the problems they can raise. And there's two key ones when we're talking about the sharing economy. And that is the issue of multi-homing and of tipping. Well, what do they mean? Put up your hand if you have more than one credit card in your wallet or purse right now. Put up your hand. I'd be amazed if there's more than a few people without their hands up. Most of you have more than one. You are multi-homing. In other words, when you reach into your pocket, you can choose Visa, MasterCard, NAB, Westpac, whoever it happens to be. You've got a choice there in real time. And so does the merchant. Almost every merchant takes a range of credit cards. Maybe not all of them, but they'll take a range. That's multi-homing. Tipping. How many of you remember the yellow pages? Put up your hand if you remember the yellow pages. Yeah, there's enough old people here. Thank you. Yellow pages was a paper directory, and there was only one of them, despite attempts to enter, because there was a tipping effect. All businesses wanted to be in the yellow pages. Why? Because all consumers looked at the yellow pages. All consumers looked at the yellow pages. Why? Because that's where all the businesses were. Now, they raise competition issues. Why? Tipping leads to market power. If Uber's there, if Lyft is there, and there are a whole bunch of alternatives, that's great, because Uber will be kept honest by the competition. But if Uber are the only guys out there with a ride-sharing service, it's not going to be too long. You know, David may have walked under a bus, because I'm sure he's well-meaning, but his successors may not be as well-meaning. They may say, damn, I've got a profit opportunity here, let's push up the prices. Everybody's with us. All the drivers have to be on Uber because that's where all the customers go. All the customers have to be on Uber because that's where all the drivers are. You've tipped. They're the sort of competition issues that we deal with in these platforms. And we've seen them. For example, why did Aldi have such problems coming into Australia? Because there were exclusive arrangements between the shopping centres and, guess who, Coles and Woolworths. They disappeared after the 2009 ACCC inquiry because of pressure put on them. If we see those same sort of exclusivity arrangements coming out of Uber or Freelancer or Airbnb or TripAdvisor and so on, we have a problem. So if Uber allows their drivers to multi-home, to be an Uber driver and a Lyft driver and perhaps a regular hire car or taxi driver, that helps get rid of a problem. But if they don't, we may have a problem going forward. That's the first one. Second one, consumer concerns. There's a real issue here, and it's already sort of partly come up in our discussions, about who is responsible and who is liable for issues relating to consumers. It's fine to talk about self-regulation. I was in India over the New Year, and there was a rape in Delhi by an Uber driver. The driver was caught rapidly because of Uber's processes. But that's one rape too many. Now, there's security issues no matter what service you have for providing rides. But the question is Uber responsible for that rape, or is somebody else responsible? It's not just an economic question, it's not just a moral question, it's also a political question, because the politicians have to deal with the pressure. So who is liable? For example, if Google runs misleading and deceptive ads, are they liable for those advertisements? Channel 9 isn't liable if it runs a misleading and deceptive advertisement because it is a publisher. Is Google a publisher? The ACCC brought an action against Google. On that basis, there was no doubt the ads were misleading and deceptive, because the advertisers had rolled over already and paid the fines, Google fought that all the way to the High Court. The High Court decided Google was an advertiser. They were not responsible. Interestingly, TripAdvisor has had effectively the reverse in Italy. TripAdvisor was found guilty of misleading and deceptive behaviour because they could not guarantee that the advice provided, the reviews, were independent, and the claim was that TripAdvisor were claiming they were independent. So they were found to be guilty in Italy. We've had Google in Europe being told that they're responsible for the content on websites that can be found through their search engines if that information relates to an individual and that individual believes that that information is no longer relevant to them. The right to be forgotten decision. I think that's a mad decision. It's the Europeans. So we have the law being created in real time. We have to ask who is responsible and how do we deal with real legitimate issues of safety. And I think there's a range of legal issues here that simply cannot be left to the market. I'd love it if the markets worked so well, the reputations worked so well that we did not have to have any consumer protection law. But we have hundreds of years of experience showing that that is not reality. And even if you doubt the economics of that, the political reality says you will have these regulations. The third part I want to talk about is the incumbents. It's really easy for us to get up here, and Matt's done it, and say, you know, we've got outdated, outmoded regulation. If you're somebody who's paid $250,000, let's go back before the Fells inquiry. If you're someone in Victoria who paid $500,000 for a taxi licence, that was the price about 4 or 5 years ago before the Fells inquiry. And Uber comes along, the government changes the rules, and your licence now becomes worthless? Is that just tough? The government had the rules. Do we just say, stuff off. You paid your money, we changed the rules, go away. Is there a moral responsibility there? I don't know, it's a tough question. I'm an economist who's been involved in at least 2 different taxi industry inquiries recommending deregulation. And every time, the key question is, that's fine, but what do you do about the people who have just bought a taxi licence, who've sunk their life savings into buying this business and you're about to make it worthless? That's a real question. That's why we still have taxi regulation here and in many countries around the world, because that's a question that is really hard to answer. So getting rid of regulation, allowing these guys in, is great. It is an improvement to the economy. There will be growth, there will be more jobs, there will be better utilisation of capital. All of that is true. But do we have an obligation to look after the incumbents? And what are the incumbents going to do? They're not going to take this stuff lying down. They're going to be out there fighting a legal battle as well as out there on the streets. And the legal battle can hurt. Just ask Napster. We often talk about first mover advantage. In these areas where you're fighting incumbents who have hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in many cases tied up in these industries, they will fight you through the courts. And they will fight you, hopefully, until they win, from their perspective. Napster was bankrupted by various legal suits, by copyright owners. We could argue that copyright laws, things like the Disneyland exemptions, are pretty silly. But the first mover got wiped out. I'm not sure if Uber's going to do a Napster at any time soon. So we also have to think about the incumbents and the regulation and whether we are responsible for them. Thanks.
Steve. Well, to all three of you, thank you so much for kicking off with those provocative remarks. Let me just step back, and if you look, David, at the diversity of regulations around the world. Now, this session isn't just about Uber. If we had any number of other verticals represented. We discussed those challenges. But what do you see as the most successful jurisdictions in terms of managing some of the issues that Stephen's brought up?
Right. Well, I will just want, the partners who drive for Uber can drive for anyone, and many do. They may be taxi drivers, they may drive for Lyft. In other countries, we have other competitors. And so the truth is, it's not just choice for consumers, it's choice for drivers. Wherever they're able to make the best living, in some cases during a day, they'll drive for all three. It's terrific for drivers. I think what we've seen is, as it relates to Uber, we just had ride-sharing regulations pass in Calcutta, India. We're making a lot of progress in Manila, in Thailand. We've had good discussions here in Victoria. So I think you're going to see more and more, but the rest of the world is basically a year and a half behind where the United States was. So a year ago, there wasn't a single city, even in the United States, that had passed ride-sharing regulations. Not a single one. And now you've had over 25. Most of our major cities, we've got regulations in California, in Chicago, in Boston, in Washington, D.C., in cities in Texas. And so I think what really helped there was time. Because some of these questions about, well, is this a zero-sum game between the existing transportation industry and Uber and Lyft? Is it going to be good for taxi drivers or not? What about the safety regimes? What about the insurance regime? And so what you've been able to see is elected officials in those major cities say, well, wait, this is a lot of jobs. I mean, in many cases, you're seeing, like in Washington, D.C., we have over 11,000 drivers. In Chicago, over 15,000. Even in big cities like that, that's like a massive company just dropping into the city and setting shop. And given our growth projections, we're only going to see that increase. So they see where people are struggling with both job creation and income opportunity, this is a terrific thing for the city. And we can enshrine in things in safety, where we have very stringent background checks. In the U.S., much more stringent than many in the existing transportation industry. And we reject a lot of people. We do have zero tolerance for driving infractions or for DUIs, which is pretty unique in this space. You can enshrine in things like insurance, so that there's very, very strong mandatory insurance requirements, vehicle inspections. And so I think that's what we've seen but I think it takes time, because in the very beginning, it's a big, and this isn't just for Uber, it's for anybody in this space, it's a big change. And there are questions about what happens to people in the space currently, and how does this serve the public or not. And I think, so time helped us more than anything else in just education. And the truth is, to most people, Uber is not a tech company in San Francisco. Here in Victoria, in New South Wales, in cities in China, in London and Chicago, Uber is the local drivers and riders. It is that local marketplace. And so I think what's happened is elected officials and regulators have heard from our drivers and from our very passionate rider base. And we have almost 200,000 people signed up for our platform here in Victoria alone. It's really growing. And so they hear that, and that it's made a big difference. You hear from people in the business community who say, I've got more customers now because Uber is dropping them off there, particularly if not on a public transportation line. You see people who care about public transportation saying, wait, we see a lot of the trips begin and end at public transportation. Uber has a great, and our competitors have a great last mile effect. So I think you're starting to see cities around the world. I mentioned some, but a lot of it comes from knowledge and experience, and them getting exposed to the product. And again, that this is not a zero-sum game, that Uber and services like it are a complement to people who are pedestrians, to public transportation, to people who use taxi, to people who drive themselves. But I think particularly for young people in urban cores, a lot of them aren't purchasing vehicles. And so it gives them a great opportunity where they have complete control over that transportation choice. And so I think more than anything else, it's been the people who drive on the Uber platform and the riders who've made the regulatory difference, who've really been out there sort of telling the story. And that's really, I think, been the most powerful asset we've had.
Matt, let me ask you a question. Do you feel that you've got market power that needs to be regulated? Come on, you've got 14 million people.
There are 3 billion people on the internet. We're a minnow at this point, absolute minnow. Right? Look, a question about this regulation stuff. I think people have to ask themselves, what sort of world do they want to live in? Because it's just we're in Australia. I'll talk about the Australian example. I've just been overseas. I came back from the UK, and we are just so regulated in this country now. It is just out of control. If you try and sell, it's illegal now to sell an egg at a market unless it's stamped by a national egg regulator. I didn't know there was a massive problem in eggs, but somehow someone decided this is good legislation. I think it's illegal to sell a boat on a Sunday in South Australia. I love coming down to Melbourne and Victoria because some special little bureaucrat in New South Wales, or series of bureaucrats, have decided to tell you what time of day you can go out at night time, what size glass you can drink out of, what the glass is made of, what liquid you can pour it at what times of night, and that changes over the course of the night, what time you need to go home, etc. And so it is just out of control, the regulation that's going on. It is just, it's nuts, right? And anyway, I was just in the UK, people were outside a pub, parked the wrong way in the street, drinking out of a glass, went across the street, came back, and no one died, right? It's just, and I come back here and it's just, I had some guys come up from Hong Kong recently. It's just, it's illegal to have a Scotch on the rocks in Sydney now after midnight. In the city of Sydney, illegal to have a Scotch on the rocks after midnight. It's just nuts, right? It's out of control, right? Anyway, that's my little tirade about regulation, and I can go forever. But look, fundamentally, some of your arguments, right? You said, these marketplaces get big. Well, yeah, online marketplaces do tend towards winner takes all, right? And buyers go where the sellers are, the sellers go where the buyers are. The reason why is they become more efficient. I want to find a Hungarian translator with experience in the automotive industry to do an app for me, right? The bigger the marketplace is, the better it is to actually find someone, the easier it is to find someone, right? So they do tend towards that. Now, if you look at some of these online marketplaces, look at eBay, for example, in Australia. eBay's number one. Who's number two in Australia after eBay? Gumtree is owned by eBay. Right? No one died, right? Right? It's all okay, right? So, I don't know if you've caught an Uber recently, but the drivers in an Uber, there's like 4 phones. There's GoCatch, there's Ingogo, there's Uber, there's whatever. Fundamentally, Uber's a fantastic service. It's growing really, really fast. But at the end of the day, there's no lock-in, right? I just want a driver. I want a good, nice, clean car coming as soon as possible, right? I don't really care which particular car turns up, although occasionally if I'm feeling special, I can click over to Uber Lux and get like a stretch limo or something crazy like that, right? Which is great, right? But at the end of the day, there's no lock-in for the drivers. They've got all the phones there. They can do whatever they want on those phones. And likewise for the customer, there's no lock-in for the customer. The other day, Google, I don't know, it's sparring prior to maybe a discussion around whether Uber will come into the Google family or not, and you won't be able to comment on that at all. But, there's a bit of sparring the other day. Google's invested a huge amount of money in Uber, and they're saying they're going to come out with their own service, right? Who knows? Maybe Apple come out with their own service. It's a highly competitive world, and I don't think we need a lot of regulation to come along and just stifle innovation.
Stephen, right of reply would seem to be in order.
Okay, I suspect some of our biggest companies, when they were starting off, would have said, "Look, we're small. What's the problem?" And the problem doesn't necessarily exist today, but the problem exists when you become large, when the tipping occurs, and you control your own rules. And Freelancer, for example, controls its own rules. There was a really nice interview in the newspapers over the weekend. I can't remember if it was the Fairfax Press or the other press, but talking about the rules that you have on Freelancer with regards to being able to bid for jobs. And the idea of it, well, you don't want it to be run down to the guy who's willing to do it for 5 cents an hour. But that wouldn't be a good outcome. So you've got a different process to some of the other platforms.
But the market doesn't work like that. People go for quality. They go for the service they want delivered, right? It doesn't. The marketplace is not like lowest cost wins.
But all I'm getting at is you've got current rules on Freelancer, which actually control the way people can bid on Freelancer.
Yeah, but they're the rules that we've set. Of course. If we didn't do a good job self-regulating ourselves or self-governing ourselves, then people wouldn't use our service.
Okay, let's say that we've tipped to Freelancer and Freelancer's wiped everyone else out. What's to stop you changing your own rules?
That's just such a fantasy world. It's just like, I would love it to happen. It's never going to happen, right? What is 7 billion people have to work through my website? Let's say Uber in Melbourne.
Sorry, Jim, I'm taking your spot. Let's say Uber in Melbourne is now the dominant ride-sharing platform. Lyft hasn't come in. Lyft is about to come in. you change the rules and say, well, sorry, if you're an Uber driver, you can't be on Lyft. As soon as you're on Lyft, we exclude you from being a driver. There is no law stopping that. There is no contract stopping that. We rely on your goodwill. And I'm sure you have goodwill at the moment. Your successors may not.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, I think that what makes this so attractive for drivers, and that's not going to change, is they have ultimate control, just like the passenger does. And I think I come at this from a unique perspective. I worked for a Democratic president of the United States. And, in our country, that means you are a believer in all things regulation, according to the opposition. And, I was involved in, President Obama said, I want to look through all the regulations on the books in the entire government. And it was fascinating. And I actually believe as a progressive, if you believe that there are rules that make sense in smart regulations, you're the first person that has an obligation when one doesn't make sense or is outdated to raise your hand. And we found hundreds of them. Things like different agencies regulated cheese pizza and pepperoni pizza. And, spilled milk was treated like an oil spill in some places. I mean, it was just stuff that maybe, I can't imagine any of that made sense at any time. A lot of it made sense at the time. And so I do think it's very important for government, and this is hard to do. I worked in government. But to stay ahead of the curve a little bit and to have regulations that, yes, protect consumers, and yes, enshrine in things like safety, but make sure that it doesn't throttle the ability for people to make a living. And so I think at the end of the day, listen, we're going to have competition all over the world. We already do. There's only going to be more of it. And that means that it's going to keep us on our toes, and we have to deliver both our driver partners and our riders. But I think that is something that across the world you are starting to see regulators and elected officials really wrestle with it, particularly in the transportation space. I mean, we have some cities around the world that have things like return to garage. What does that mean? That means if someone's out and they take a fare to a hotel or a business, they've got to go back to their base before they pick up another fare. It makes no sense at all. And so you look at these things, and again, I'm not sure when that made sense. It certainly makes no environmental sense, no efficient sense. So we have to make sure that there's regulations. And again, we're actually, you and I may have a little disagreement about this, which is we're actually okay with, and not just okay with, but are seeking a regulatory pathway forward with local governments, but in a way that does not stifle the ability to make a living, that's good for consumers, that's good for the local economy. And so I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of reasons just to say no to things, but at a time when so you've got basically congestion afflicting cities all over the world. You've got huge economic imperative to actually add to income and create jobs. You've got a huge imperative to make transportation more safe. Cities have to say yes to this, and more of them are.
Let me add just a few more of the implemented or proposed rules that ride-sharing has been presented with. Cap the number of ride-share cars on the road, 24-hour window on pre-booking. In other words, you cannot book within 24 hours. Make booking ride-share by GPS illegal. Cars have to be newer than 4 years. No drop-offs at the airport. Ban surge pricing. Minimum time for a ride in a private car is 1 hour. Now, all of these rules would have the effect of protecting incumbents, but all of them are very, very inefficient. And I think there are lessons that we can derive from successful processes of microeconomic reform, both in Australia and elsewhere, about how to get the efficiency upside while still achieving an acceptable outcome in terms of distribution or the transition for the incumbents. Stephen, what are the lessons you would draw from Australia's microeconomic reforms in the 90s about how to get that efficiency dividend without giving up on the people who happen to be caught in the crossfire?
Okay, so first, we can all come up with our silly regulations. There are lots and lots of silly regulations. The question here isn't about whether we support a whole bunch of silly regulations or regulations that involve vested interests and incumbents trying to stop Uber from competing. The question is, what are the appropriate regulations for Uber, for Freelancer, for Airbnb, for a range of these different platforms that are emerging? And we've got to make sure that we don't stop them emerging, because you're dead right, this is a positive-sum game. There are overall winners from this process, but we have to work out the best way to ensure that, the guys who become the ultimate winners don't start making the rest of us losers. And that's a threat. Now, maybe we can leave it to competition law. So, answering Jim's question, there are a whole bunch of areas where we can say, look, we just have general rules about market power and about taking advantage of market power, about mergers, creating market power, and maybe we can just leave the sharing economy there. Maybe we can say, okay, look, freelancer, yeah, the chances are that you're not going to dominate the world. If you do, then we'll worry about you then, and we've got general laws to deal with that. And that's fine. Maybe that's one solution. Maybe another solution that we can have for Uber is to say, well, you know what, we don't need any of this regulation. We should just deregulate taxis and hire cars and all of that stuff. Well, you know, this is all silly regulation. Now, New Zealand actually tried that for a brief period of time. Interestingly, it actually didn't work, and they had to bring regulation back in. Some of the regulations that they had was that if you wanted to be a taxi driver, you had to join an approved taxi organisation. You had to have a booking service. You actually had to display your prices, because there was a period of time there where if you jumped in a taxi in Auckland, it could be very, very average car, and I know because I went in a couple of them, and you basically bargained with the driver about what the prices were and hoped the driver didn't change their mind on the trip. So you had a great situation there of complete deregulation and then sort of saying, actually, this doesn't work. This creates a whole lot of problems for consumers, and we'll bring back a little bit of regulation. So the lessons are, some stuff we can leave to the general competition laws. And yeah, freelancer, I probably think you're one of those. Other stuff, we've seen experiments of the total deregulation, and we've said actually that doesn't actually work very well. And we need to think a bit more carefully about what the regulations have to be. So we've got experience from around the world.
Let me just push a little harder though, because 1 in 100 startups is a success. So what to you is an acceptable return on equity for the ones that do get there? And there's a different way to think about competition, which is not we've got to drive everybody down to their absolute marginal ex post opportunity cost. The view would be, let's make sure that we get rapid innovation, and that's going to result in some ex post quote unquote monopoly rents. But thought about in a dynamic context, you'd be all for those because that is what drives innovation. So, you know, to my mind, any quote-unquote monopoly rents I'm seeing in the ride-sharing or other sectors looks like pretty much part of that dynamic efficiency.
Yeah, so if Uber gets monopoly rents because the customers love it, the drivers love it, but there's nothing stopping the drivers and the customers from saying, you know what, Uber's sort of raised its prices, it's not providing as good a service, we're going across to Lyft. If they're making money, then good on them, because they're making money out of competing better than anyone else. But if Uber starts doing things such as saying, gosh, Lyft is on the way in, an Uber driver cannot be a Lyft driver, and I recognise that's not the case at the moment, okay? So I'm not saying this is the case, I'm dealing with a hypothetical. But it's a hypothetical that may arise in the future. And as soon as they step over the law, or the line there, then there is a legal issue that they have to face. They are abusing market power, and that is a regulation that is out there to protect Australian businesses and Australian consumers and make sure that it is a positive-sum game.
Do either of you have comments? And then I've got a whole set of fascinating questions from the audience to run through as well.
I mean, I just think at the end of the day, we're kind of looking a little bit at sort of ghosts in the shadows. I mean, I think that what is clear, and this is what's happening today, so this isn't theoretical, and will continue today and tomorrow, is that, you know, this is right now, and again, there are competitors here in Australia, in China, in India, in the US, in Latin America. There's only going to be more. And so this is a marketplace, and the riders will vote based on where they're getting the best service, where they feel the safest, where they like the drivers the best, where they get the best price, where the wait time's the least. And the drivers are obviously, and are right now, as Matt said, many of them here in Victoria. If you go to the US, you land at San Francisco Airport, a lot of them are driving Uber, Lyft, taxi. And again, let's look at where the world was not too long ago. These drivers didn't have any other option. Now they have a lot of different options. And there also was a barrier to letting people in the barrier to being in the transportation sector was extraordinarily high. Now, Someone who's got a car, might have lost their job, needs a little extra money, they pass a background check, they get on the road. Now, if they're not doing a good job, they're not going to get good ratings. They may not stay on the road, but if they're doing a good job, providing a good service. So that is something that should be, I think, nourished. Because again, we're at a place right now where one of the central economic challenges facing almost every country is how do we get incomes up? In some cases, there's still a pronounced job creation issue. But even where unemployment is, you know, it's really not great anywhere, but where unemployment is satisfactory, you still have too many people. And Uber and services like it are providing an enormous opportunity for people to earn both a good living, if that's their sole job, but their ability to really augment that income. So I think at the end of the day, you know, this is an extraordinarily competitive sector. It's only going to get more competitive. And I think particularly as more cities and countries pass a way forward and there's clarity on the regulatory front, you're going to see even more people get in this space.
Matt.
Look, you can't fight progress, and you can't fight technology, and you can't fight the internet, right? And I just wish we lived in a world, in a country, where the debate amongst people in government and our political leaders was how can we, you know, terraform the economy to, you know, be more proactive around technology, innovation, science, engineering, you know, all these sort of things, and what we can do in this country as opposed to what we can't. And every day, let me tell you, every day, and living in Sydney, it's a very special place because every day there's a new regulation on what I can and cannot do. Luckily, maybe I'll move to Melbourne one day, but you know, there is just, you know, so many things that we can do with this amazing explosion in innovation and technology that's out there that I really think that, you know, government needs to step back. The sharing economy is all about better utilization of resources, lowering the costs, better marshalling of those resources. It's great in so many different ways, right? Now, you know, and I think, you know, where Uber is now is not really what the end game is. I mean, I kind of want to tell a story that I think there's an even bigger issue down the track. And whether it's Uber or Google or whatever, someone's going to do it, is what happens with when automation all comes into this industry, right? So, you know, down the track, you know, Google's got self-driving cars. They're safer, they're more fuel efficient. You know, they'll reduce congestion on the roads. You know, if you have a household with a family, you won't have to have 2 or 3 or 4 cars anymore. The husband will go to work in the morning, will come pick up the wife, drop the wife off, etc. Go pick up the kids, take the kids to school, etc. and so on. That's going to be so good for so many different reasons in terms of, you know, dealing with congestion and this, that, the other, and efficiency. And as I said before, you know, 96% of cars are just idle most of the time, right? I think the bigger issues are, well, what happens in the world down the track? And it is going to happen, whether people like it or not. It will happen. You know, in terms of how do you know, reskill the economy, right? So that all the people involved in, you know, jobs in transportation, et cetera, and so forth, actually move into other jobs. Because, you know, all technology does create, you know, it does disrupt, does take jobs away down the track, but it also will create new jobs. And I think that, you know, they're the broader issues. You know, I post a job for a computer science graduate, and I get maybe one or two applicants a day come through, and I'm hiring by the metric ton. I posted a job for an office manager. I had like 350 applications per day coming through. Right. The first thing I saw when I got the office manager applications was, wow, I don't really want to look through all these CVs. And the second thing I thought was, well, gee, I wouldn't want to be an office manager. And the third thing I thought was, well, who's going to retrain all these office managers to go out there and, you know, do something new, right? And I think you know, the bigger issue is down the track. We should be really thinking about not you know, in terms of GDP of the economy, not the old world industries, but what the new world industries are, and how we can move the economy towards that.
Okay, can I two responses? Okay, first off, whilst I've been running a theoretical with Uber and Freelancer up here, it's not actually theory in the real world, because we have seen Google in court in Europe and in Australia. We have seen TripAdvisor in court in Europe. We have seen, for example, in Australia, internet mergers stopped by the ACCC. Now, whether you think they were right or wrong, they stopped, for example, car sales and the Trading Post merging, because they felt they were the 2 biggest internet platforms for car sales, and that if they got, stop smiling, Danny, you were on the team that stopped that, after I'd finished as commissioner, and you know my views on it, the ACCC stopped that. So we are actually seeing these issues real time, in real life, in Australia and around the world. So yeah, you guys don't have market power at the moment, or I'd be amazed if you did, in any country where you're operating, but you may have it tomorrow. And that doesn't mean we can sort of say, hey, life's fine because you don't have it today. We have to think ahead towards tomorrow for our regulations. The second point is, I'm going to come back on the, oh God, we're all going to be ruined because nobody's going to have any jobs tomorrow bet. I think that is complete nonsense. And there is, technology will hurt people. Okay, one of it, and Uber's a simple micro example of taxi owners. Technology and jobs is a macro level one, and maybe all university professors will be out of work in 3 years' time because all our students will be streaming in classes from, Larry Summers in Harvard and Paul Krugman at Princeton. So I'll be out of a job and I'll be on Freelancer looking for some odd jobs and perhaps fixing some doors.
I'll be watching your account.
History shows us that it is positive sum. History also shows us that more jobs will be created than are destroyed over the longer term. The world, or the developed world, has been an amazing job creation machine for at least the last 200 years. It has made far more jobs than it's destroyed. That includes in recent times. People forget, back in the 1960s, most women in Australia did not work. Now we have reasonable levels of female participation. I think it could be higher, but that's a whole bunch of new jobs that are being created. Where are the new jobs going to come from? That's always the next question. Just, Stephen, you've told us the new jobs are going to appear. Where are they going to come from? I wish I knew, because I could become really, really rich by getting there first and investing in those industries. But history over the last 250 years has shown us they will come. But we can't predict where in advance. But some people will lose in the short term, and the question for us as a society is how do we make sure those positive sums get spread around?
I think we've just gone to swap sides in the debate.
Almost. Let me turn it over to questions from the audience. So to my mind, one of the really striking things about peer-to-peer is the exploitation of reputation and information that was previously hidden. One of the questions is, where else can we use this model? For example, in the public sector. Have any of you thought about models which might not be disruptable by a private firm, but which could be applied by the public sector? Is it health? Is it education?
Absolutely, but you get sued for defamation, right? Someone leaves a negative review on a doctor in Australia, you're gone, right? There's plenty of things you could do, but it's just not possible thanks to how we set the laws up.
I think it's interesting, and when I was in government in the U.S., this is a topic of discussion because, people's expectations are rising. They don't discriminate and say, I expect a different level of speed or efficiency because you are a small business or you're an education institution or you're a government. People expect the same level of speed, whether they're, on, BBC or Amazon or YouTube. And so that's a test for government, is that you have to make sure over time that you press a button and you can reach somebody, or you get an answer, or you are able to provide feedback. And so I think, like I can't speak authoritatively about what's happening here in Australia, but in the US, they've brought in a lot of, really great innovators from Silicon Valley to try and refashion the US government, which will probably take 312 years. But basically, it is inconsistent right now with how people are living the rest of their lives. It's too slow, it's too burdensome, particularly young people. I learned this from political campaigns. If a young person couldn't find out in a minute, maybe even less than that, how to register to vote, or where to get information, it was hard to ever get them back. You lost them. And so with government right now, I think the bar, and I think this place where government, they need to obviously figure out regulations that foster innovation and competition and job creation. But just from a service standpoint and boosting confidence and that customer experience, they have so long to go. But again, I think if they I'm getting a little bit on my soapbox here, but if they fall too far below the private sector, and they're already really far below, that's going to continue to make people skeptical, I think, and erode trust. And so that's so in the US, that was, how can you get to the point where, people are able, and if you look at like the healthcare website, which was obviously a global joke, but it is better than what was there before now, where people can easily compare plans and shop. Nowhere near where it needs to get in simplicity. But a lot of city governments have to deal with that, which is if you want to go on there and re-register your license or figure out how to order a new trash can, it takes forever. And that's not acceptable. And so I think what you see is smart mayors, smart elected officials are trying to figure out how can we bring our service and that customer experience at least in the same vicinity of how people are experiencing the rest of their digital life. And I think that's a real challenge for government, in the coming years.
Other thoughts?
Health, education, welfare. Think of where the government spends the money. All of those could be improved by better adoption of technology. In some cases, it's vested interests internally. You mentioned the doctors, best union in Australia, that oppose the change. In other cases, it just seems to be, it's slow, the incentives aren't there, they don't face the competitive pressures that these guys face, so there isn't the incentive to innovate and bring in new technology.
I think what's interesting, there's just a simple test, which is if someone's gone on the Uber app or to Amazon or to, BBC or Freelancer, they kind of look forward to the experience. And so before most people have to say, oh, I've got to interact with the motor vehicle department, or I want to find out where a job, they just dread it, right? Because they know it's going to be a burdensome thing.
One more question from the list, and then let's open it up. I think this question touches on the deep origins of peer-to-peer. If you think about it from the point of view of a computer scientist, peer-to-peer has no center, right? Internet protocol doesn't have a platform. So the question is as follows: what do the speakers think about peer-to-peer economic exchanges that are truly distributed, maybe even with no money? Now this is, I think what we're now touching on is maybe the Bitcoin, maybe something non-monetary. Matt, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't know how many of you actually know what Bitcoin is, the network, as opposed to, or the blockchain, as opposed to Bitcoin, the currency. And a lot of the press you see out there talks about BTC, which is the currency of Bitcoin, which goes up and down in value. But effectively, there's been a breakthrough with Bitcoin in solving a particular problem in computer science called the Byzantine generals problem, which is basically, in layman's terms, if I have 4 generals and the 4 generals want to attack a city, and the only way that the generals, all have to attack at the same time, the city, in order for this attack to be successful. But the only way they can communicate with each other is by sending a messenger, and the messenger has to go through the city, who of course will capture or substitute, and so forth. So it's a solution to that particular problem, which is how do you get consensus in a distributed fashion, right? And in the case of Bitcoin, it's consensus over who owns what. It's a distributed asset register, right? There is no trusted third party in the middle. There is no bank, there is no government. It literally, there's an algorithm which all the parties who are actors in this network can participate in, who reach consensus on something, right? And over time, people have come up with all these really neat applications of using the Bitcoin network to do other things. They've done crowdfunding. You can now, there's algorithms to crowdfund using the Bitcoin network. There's algorithms to issue shares and take in equity if it was legal in countries to do so. There are ways in which people can issue dividends, deliver interest. There's social welfare policies over Bitcoin. So there's wealth redistribution in terms of taxation and income supplementation. And people have figured out how to build marketplaces using the Bitcoin network that don't use a freelancer in the middle or an Uber in the middle, where literally the people can actually go and reach consensus over the reputation of people and the transfer of money to people. So, it's pretty exciting, and there's a lot of innovation that will happen there, and, this is one of the many things that keeps me up at night.
Great. Well, let me open it up now to the floor. We have got limited time. Can I please encourage people to, first, wait until you've got the mic. Second, ask a brief question. Thank you. Down the back on the left.
Hi, my name's Neil Farrow. Very quick question. We've avoided a macro policy issue here. For tax purposes, where's Uber domiciled and how much tax does it pay in Australia? And what's the public policy implications over peer-to-peer and the lack of taxation erosion that it causes?
Well, it's interesting because I think it differs by country, obviously, but the transportation industry generally has been a heavy cash industry. And I think what you see is Uber and its services really bring a lot of that out of the shadows. And so you're going to have a lot higher degree of compliance. It's a cashless exercise. And so you see, and we're different than a lot of tech companies in that, we're not an advertising company. We are a local company. So Uber is, we've got local teams of people running the local operation. We've got a lot of local drivers, as I spoke about, over 2,500 here in Victoria alone. And all that money's staying in the local economy. And so I think that, and part of our discussion with governments is obviously around issues of tax and finance around the world. But in terms of, I think the impact in terms of the budgetary impact for the local governments, I think it's a big addition to the pie, which was missing before, where I think a lot of that money was not disclosed. And I think that because it is staying in the local economy, it is a different model than most tech companies in a way that we think is very beneficial locally.
Great, there's a question down on the right.
There's no GST on Uber fares.
Well, I believe what the law here in Australia is at a certain income level, the GST kicks in.
So if an Uber
wait a moment,
driver
just
is making
Stephen.
more than $50,000 a year, they should register for GST, but it's not currently Uber's responsibility. So there is a question about tax as to who is responsible. So for example, Amazon is now charging sales tax on sales within the US to certain states. Now previously within the US, if you walked across into Maine and bought something, wandered back into Massachusetts, formerly the individual was responsible for the sales tax payment. Now of course nobody ever did that, which was great for the shopping malls in Maine. That's an open question, but it's not just a new economy question. Companies have been transferring money around the world and using fancy transfer systems to minimise tax payments for a long time. So there are open questions about the sharing economy, but there's open questions about other companies too.
Great, there's a question down on the right, and then we'll move over here to a bit forward. Yeah.
Thanks. Just got a couple of quick questions for David. My name's David Swan. I'm a journalist with Tech Spectator. Just wondering, why does you were talking about Uber drivers supporting their families? Why does Uber not then treat their employees, their drivers like employees, and give them benefits like expenses and things like that? And just secondly, I was just wondering, since you've come on board, I noticed lately Uber's kind of taken the shoot first, ask questions later approach in terms of giving their drivers money to pay for fines and things like that. Has the approach kind of changed since you've come on board at all, or are you kind of going to continue that approach worldwide?
Well, I think a lot of, we stand by our partner drivers when there are fines and issues like that. But I think, I think there has been a misconception about the shoot first, ask questions later. I mean, we are, as I said, actively engaged with trying to build partnerships with government. Some of that is on a regulatory pathway forward, as we've done in many cities around the world. It is working on job creation, income opportunities, programs around congestions. We are doing a lot of great work in the disability community where transportation options always haven't been terrific for people in those circumstances. So I think in terms of these are independent contractors. And I think what's important to know, like here in Australia, the average Uber driver drives 19, 20 hours a week. Most of them have additional income. We just did a big seminal study in the US about our drivers with a Princeton economist, Alan Kruger, who used to be the Council of Economic Advisors chairman at the White House. And it was a fascinating look into our driver population. In terms of, in the US too, most of our drivers are driving on UberX, they're driving 18, 19 hours. They desire flexibility above all else. Most of them had a full-time income, so we're doing this supplemental, or their spouse might have had a full-time job and they were driving to augment family income. And I think that this is something that, I think the proof is in the number of people that are signing up for the platform every day around the world. There is huge demand, in part because it's a good income opportunity, in part because it's the most flexible thing, I think, out there in the economy. And it allows people to utilize an asset that's underutilized in a way that's completely consistent with how they want to live their lives. And so we think it's a model that works. But again, there are, here in Australia, I think it's, now we do have full-time drivers for sure who are driving 35, 40 hours a week. But you're seeing more and more of the business model move to people who are part-time. And again, those are people we should, I think from a regulatory standpoint, make sure that, yes, there's got to be standards on background checks and insurance and inspections, but that the barrier to entry is reasonable so that those people can augment their income and make a good living. And I think that's what you're seeing, is it's opening up the transportation sector to a wider segment of the population.
Hi, my name is Sue. I just wanted to ask, in regard with regulations, that we see that companies like Uber come into the market and then governments are like, oh, well, how can we regulate these guys? Or how can we introduce new regulation? But is there any government or any instance where we're going the other way around, like saying, oh, how about we go and see startup guys, talk to them. What are the entries to barrier to those startups? So rather than working once they're in the market, are there any governments working with them previously? So if there are severe, like very, say, with the license for taxis that is really expensive, are there any governments that are doing, like working before having these apps out there?
So to repose the question, so let me check if I've understood it. Are there governments who've reached out to entrants to say, how can we help you enter this market and introduce competition into the market? Matt, do you get...
Not that I know of in Australia. Yeah, I mean, there are governments that are very technology forward around the world that do very positive things all the time. I mean, like Chile, for example, has done a whole bunch of things in terms of Startup Chile, the class of visa to get entrepreneurs in from Silicon Valley into Latin America. They give them money, $40,000 with no strings attached, just come for 6 months, work with Latin American entrepreneurs, go back home and form linkages. There's all sorts of things like that in a lot more progressive countries out there, but in Australia we've actually gone backwards in most of the things that have had to do with technology. We cut funding to the grant programs for both startups, we cut and also to venture funds. We've taken away one of the main remuneration schemes, which is around granting of equity to employees, which is basically transferring wealth from owners to workers in businesses. We've kind of really caused a huge issue there. And in fact, I made a submission on Friday to them around the changes in taxation, which is said to be rolling it back, but aren't really. No, I think pretty much all the things I can think of. I can't really think of really anything positive in Australia that's actually happened recently. And I'll be honest. I mean, if someone has an example, I'll be glad to know about it.
David.
Not enough. We are starting to see more governments around the world sort of lean forward and say, okay, how can we actually accelerate some change to allow I think first of all, they're particularly enamored of the job creation and the income opportunity. But I think a lot of people are really excited about Uberpool, the carpooling service I talked about. Their eyes light up when they think about, given our congestion problems, if we can play a role in cutting that down in a way that makes transportation more affordable, which has huge economic benefit for people, particularly lower income, saves them money in terms of commuting to work, and we're creating jobs, it's kind of a great trifecta. And so I think you're starting to see more people lean in, but not enough. I made a joke about the regulatory look back I was involved in Washington, and there were some funny examples. But that was actually the reason that happened was the president had heard enough from the business community about regulations. And some of it's just ideological debate, less versus more. But he'd heard enough specific examples. He said, I really want to look into this because if there are things on the books that are really old, outdated, that really don't serve any purpose, that are actually complicating the ability for people to grow and create jobs, I want to know. And we found a lot. And I think what happens is a lot of governments, these regulations go on the books. And it's the old saying, it's a lot harder to get rid of a law than to pass one. And so things just stay on and they sort of ossify. And I do think governments, again, I'm not in government anymore, but governments would be well served as quickly as the world is moving, as quickly as the economy is changing, to make sure with some frequency you're kind of reviewing things. Now, ideally, it would be to say, let's step back and say, what could we do to really foster innovation and investment? But ideally, doing no harm.
There's a question way down the back.
Yes, Matt, you've actually been on our Facebook page and left very quickly when we asked you the hard questions. We're from Victorian taxi families. When we asked you, you've been told by the Insurance Council of Australia your passengers are not insured, you left. When we asked you why you don't pay commercial insurance, you couldn't answer.
Okay, can you please get to the question?
Please, let me ask the question. Please explain to me, when we've all registered with Uber, there is no criminal background check. Why? And number two, you don't actually have, nobody's allowed to register with your company with an ABN. Why is that? Why? When we pay as a second income, they should be paying a 40% tax and they're paying none. And we can provide you with at least 500 examples where you've just lied openly to all these people.
Thanks. I think just brief questions, please. So do you have a response?
Well, I'll try and be civil in my response. We background check every driver. Well, we do, and actually, we end up rejecting. Well, in fact, we are involved here in Victoria in an accreditation process with the government. So all those drivers are accredited by the government. Well, they are going through the process. We have, I think, the commercial liability policy here is $5.8 million. So the point is that from an insurance standpoint, from a background check standpoint, from riders not having an anonymous experience for knowing whose car they're in, for the rider being able to rate the driver being able to rate it's the safest way for people to get around the city.
Great. We had a question.
Can I make just a comment? Last time I caught a taxi in Sydney, I was at the casino and I said, "Can you take me to the Opera House?" And the taxi driver didn't know where the Opera House was. I took a taxi from downtown. And I said, "Take me to Bondi Beach." And they said, "Which direction is that?" And I said, "The water," right? Like, I mean, whatever we have, this is my opinion, right? I mean, Uber is a much better service than what we have now. It's more reliable. The cars are better. Well,
Okay. Thanks. Thanks.
Okay.
We've got a question down the back on the left.
Oh, hi, my name's Jared. I'm with the Consumer Action Law Centre, and thanks for the discussion tonight. I'm interested in who's liable when things go wrong. So if my freelancing work doesn't get done and my website's not created and I miss out on a big business opportunity, will Freelancer pay up and compensate me? If my Airbnb apartment is cancelled just before I want to check in, will Airbnb recompense me with a hotel suite?
We're just a marketplace. So you find someone to design a logo for you. If there's a problem with the logo, no, we just provide the connection between the buyer and the seller. We don't get in the middle.
And there are, just to expand on that, different markets have different degrees of depth when it comes to that risk management. And, you know, those things, I think, are legitimate policy questions. As long as there's clarity to the consumer, you get a lot of the way to the right answer. As long as the buyer understands what would happen in that eventuality, then you get some direction. Stephen, do you have any things to add to that question?
Yeah, I think it's a bit naive, actually, your response there, Jim, because you're sort of saying, well, it'll be okay as long as the consumer understands. So I book, let's say, an Airbnb, so I won't need the company here. I book an Airbnb apartment in, I don't know, Salzburg. I go there, I find out it's being completely misrepresented on the website, and in fact, it's a terrible place. I've done my dough. It's fine for you to say, well, you know, you knew that was a risk there, and you can always take legal action under Austrian law. I have no idea what Austrian law is like, far less taking action under there. So the idea, well, look, I'm just a platform, or Airbnb's just a platform. It's got nothing to do with this. That sort of washing my hands type approach. I'm not sure that's going to be a long-term viable solution. And similarly with the ABNs. You know, I go to a bank, I want to open an account. I have to show various identification. I need to give a tax file number, or they withhold tax at 40%. You know, how come the platform doesn't have to do that for the drivers that it's hiring? So these are real regulatory questions that need to be addressed. I don't think there is a simple one right answer, and I think we need to have the debate.
Great. Other questions? There's right in the middle, somebody with their hand still up? Yeah. I think the mic's heading to you. Further back, a couple of rows back.
Thank you. Mine's just a very... Oh, sorry.
No, that's...
mine's just a very quick question. I'm actually... I've used Uber. I use Freelancer every week, and also Airbnb. I think just the general tone of a couple of the questions here certainly don't reflect my usage. There, you know, I think a lot of people are getting great use out of it, and the fact that there was a mention that's the, you know, we should think about potential problems about some of these issues that may come you know, be in the future, I think is just silly. So anyway, I just wanted to make a comment more than anything.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Hang on, can I just...
Yeah, but...
Yeah, can I just respond? Jim's going to get annoyed with me. Yeah, let me reiterate my first line. These are fantastic services. You know, thank God I'm alive now, because we are seeing change on an unprecedented basis of all these great things that we can do that 10 years ago we couldn't do. And my God, it's fantastic. But at the same time, we have to do this with our eyes open. And it's just all too easy to pop on the rose-coloured glasses and say, we are in the best of all possible worlds and life is good, thank you, internet. And I think if we do that, we're going to look stupid in 5 or 10 years or 15 years. We need to work the law, the regulations, and the internet have to move forward together.
Thank you. Look, I think we're now right out of time. So out of time. Excuse me. So
Right out of town.
I clearly need a GPS. So thank you so much for the excellent interactions, David. Thank you, Matt, Stephen, and the audience. I found this fascinating, and I hope you have too. And if I can thank on behalf of the Grattan Institute, the State Library of Victoria, for hosting us, thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Good.